The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1883, and by Wednesday morning Pauline Alden had already packed her trunk and bought a train ticket west. She stood on the platform at the Chicago and Northwestern station, with her dark hair pinned under a gray traveling hat, her jaw set in that particular way her mother always said made her look more like her father than she could possibly know. The letter was tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, close to her heart, not out of sentiment but out of necessity. She had read it so many times in the past 24 hours that the paper had grown soft at the folds, and she was afraid it might fall apart entirely if she wasn't careful with it. The letter was from a man named Deputy Earl Hadson, writing from the town of Caldwell in the Kansas Territory, near the Oklahoma border. He had written to inform her that her father, one Jeremiah Alden, had died 6 weeks prior of a fever that had swept through the cattle camp where he'd been working. He had died peacefully, Deputy Hadson wrote, which Pauline suspected was the kind of thing people wrote in letters to spare the feelings of the living. He had died with few possessions to his name, but among those possessions was a Colt single-action Army revolver, serial number etched along the barrel, which the deputy was holding at the Caldwell Sheriff's Office until someone came to claim it. That gun was the only thing left of her father in the world, and Pauline intended to have it. She was 24 years old and had been running her mother's millinery shop in Chicago for the past 3 years, ever since her mother's hands had grown too stiff with age to do the fine needlework herself. She was not a woman given to impulse. She was careful and precise, good with numbers, better with people, and she had not seen her father in 11 years. He had gone west when she was 13, promising he would send for them soon, and the soon had stretched and stretched until it became a kind of permanent arrangement in which he sent money sometimes and letters occasionally, and nothing else at all. Her mother had died 2 years ago. Pauline had written to tell him, and he had written back a single page of grief that had the distinct quality of a man who felt things deeply, but had long since lost the vocabulary for expressing them. And now he was gone too, and she was going to Caldwell, Kansas to collect his gun, and she told herself very firmly on the train platform that this was a practical matter and not an emotional one. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't figure it out until later. The train west was 3 days of rattling iron and coal smoke, and the slow transformation of landscape from the cluttered greenery of the Illinois flatlands into something wider and emptier and almost frightening in its openness. Pauline pressed her face to the window and watched the prairie unroll itself, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. She arrived in Caldwell on a Saturday afternoon in late April, when the sun was beginning to tip toward the horizon, and the light was going gold and long across the dirt street. The town was smaller than she'd expected and louder than she'd feared. The cattle trade was still running hot through Caldwell in those years, and the street was full of drovers and merchants and horses tied at every rail. And somewhere down the way, a piano was playing something cheerful and slightly off-key through the open door of a saloon. Pauline stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the train depot with her trunk at her feet and her hat slightly askew from the journey, and looked at all of it with the careful, cataloging gaze of a woman who has learned to take stock of situations before she steps into them. She found the sheriff's office without much difficulty. It was a low adobe building on the east side of the main street, with a hand-lettered sign above the door and a broom leaning against the outside wall. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The man behind the desk was not Deputy Hadson. He was younger than she'd expected from the letter, somewhere in his late 20s, she guessed, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a face that was all straight lines and weathered angles, like something carved from local stone. He was bent over the desk writing something, and he looked up when she came in, and she saw that his eyes were a deep, particular shade of brown that made her think of creek water in October. He stood immediately. That surprised her. In her experience, men in positions of minor official authority tended not to stand for women unless they were very well-mannered or trying to impress someone. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Deputy Hadson," she said. "My name is Pauline Alden. I received a letter about my father's effects." Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the way a person looks when they've been waiting for something they weren't certain would actually arrive. "Jeremiah Alden's daughter," he said. "Yes." He extended his hand. "Thomas Lockhart. I'm the one who wrote that letter, actually. I signed Earl's name because he asked me to. He's not much for writing, and I'd already written half a dozen others like it for men in the camp." Pauline shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he dropped her hand without lingering. She appreciated that. "You were at the camp?" she asked. "I was one of the drovers working the Kishom that season," he said. "Your father and I worked the same outfit for about 4 months. He was a good man, Miss Alden. I wanted to say that first before anything else. He was a genuinely good man." Pauline had not expected that. She had expected the formality of an official transaction, the handing over of a gun and the signing of some paper, and she had steeled herself for that. She had not steeled herself for sincerity, and it hit her in an unguarded place. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The gun is in the back," Thomas said. "But if you don't mind my asking, did you come all the way from Chicago just for it?" "I did." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Then I'd like to talk to you if you'll allow it. Not tonight, you must be exhausted from the journey, but tomorrow if you're staying. There are things about your father I think you should know." Pauline wanted to say she could hear it now, that she hadn't come all this way to wait another day. But the truth was she was exhausted, deeply exhausted in the way that went past the body and into the bones, and she could feel the long train journey in every joint she owned. "I'll be at the Drover's Rest Hotel," she said. "Come back in the morning," he nodded. "I'll have everything ready for you." She took the gun that evening. He retrieved it from a locked box in the back room and placed it on the desk between them, and she picked it up with careful hands. It was heavier than she remembered. She had been 13 the last time she'd held it, standing in the yard of their house in Ohio while her father showed her how to check whether it was loaded. He had been very serious about that. "Always know the condition of your weapon, Paulie. Never assume." She ran her thumb along the barrel and felt the serial number under her skin and pressed her lips together and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. Thomas Lockhart watched her do this and said nothing either, and she was grateful for that too. She walked to the hotel in the fading evening light with the gun wrapped in the cloth Thomas had kept it in, and her trunk being brought along by the depot boy she'd paid a nickel. And she lay awake for a long time in the narrow hotel bed listening to the sounds of Caldwell at night. The distant piano, a dog barking, the wind off the prairie that crept in through the window gap and smelled like grass and something ancient and wide. She thought about her father, and she thought about the man with October eyes who had written her the letter, and eventually she slept. Morning came clear and bright with a cold wind from the north that made the dust dance in the street. Pauline dressed carefully in a blue wool dress that was less wrinkled than the gray one from the day before, and she pinned her hair neatly. And she told herself she was taking care with her appearance because she was a professional woman who always took care with her appearance and not for any other reason. She had breakfast at the small restaurant next to the hotel, where a stout woman named Mrs. Gruber served excellent coffee and passable eggs, and asked her 3 times where she was from, and seemed delighted each time to hear Chicago, as if the city were a distant paradise whose ambassador had unexpectedly materialized in her dining room. Thomas Lockhart was already at the sheriff's office when she arrived, and he had made coffee, real coffee, which she discovered was something of an achievement in Caldwell, where the quality of such things was variable. And he had set 2 chairs across from each other in front of the desk, rather than sitting behind it the way officials did. That small thing told her something about him that she filed away. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, accepting the cup he offered. The tin cup was warm against her palms. "I was up early," he said, settling into his chair with the easy, economical movement of a man accustomed to being in his body. I kept thinking about what I wanted to tell you and trying to figure out the right order for it. Just tell me, Pauline said. I'm not fragile. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. No, I don't imagine you are, not if you're Jeremiah's daughter. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. You said he was a good man. He was. He was also, Thomas said carefully, a man who had made a promise to my father and who kept it even when it cost him considerably. Pauline set down her cup. Your father, Samuel Lockhart, he and your father drove cattle together out of Texas in the 70s, before the drive started coming north through Kansas. They were friends for years, the kind of friendship that gets made when men share hard work and harder weather for long enough. Thomas folded his hands together and looked at them. My father was killed in the winter of 1878. He was coming back from Dodge City with the season's wages, and there was a robbery. He wasn't the only man killed that night. I'm sorry, Pauline said. The men who did it were never caught, Thomas said. But before he died, my father had given your father a package to keep for him. Papers, mostly a land deed and some letters and a few other things. My father was afraid something would happen to him on that road, and your father was the man he trusted most. He made your father promise to see that the package got to me when I was old enough. Pauline was very still. How old were you? 14, Thomas said. When it happened, your father found me through my mother in San Antonio and sent me a letter explaining what he was keeping for me and told me to come find him when I was of age. I did. I came to find him when I was 18, and we spent that whole summer together on the drives, and he gave me the package. The land deed, Pauline said slowly. For a piece of ground about 40 miles south of here, Thomas said. It's mine now. I've been working it for the past 3 years. It's not much yet, a house and a barn and about 60 head of cattle, but it's growing. He paused. Your father kept that package safe for 4 years, Miss Alden. He never opened it, never touched the deed, never once thought about what he could have done with land like that if he'd wanted to. He kept his word to my father even when he had a wife and daughter and very little money of his own. Pauline's throat had gone tight. She looked at the window, at the strip of bright Kansas sky visible through the glass, and breathed carefully. He never told us, she said. He never said a word about any of it. He wouldn't have, Thomas said quietly. He didn't think it was his story to tell. It was my family's. She turned back to look at him and found him watching her with an expression of such careful, earnest regard that she had to look away again. He talked about you, Thomas said. When we were on the drives together, he talked about you and your mother a great deal. He said he'd made a mess of things by staying west so long, and that he knew it, and that he didn't know how to fix it at that point without making it worse somehow. That sounds like him, Pauline said, and there was both fondness and grief in it, tangled together the way those things always are. He asked me to do something, Thomas said. When he knew he was sick, he asked me to make sure you got the gun, and he asked me to make sure you understood that he thought about you every single day he was out here. He said he knew that wasn't enough, but he wanted you to know it. Pauline pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were very bright, and she was grateful for the moment Thomas looked away and gave her the privacy of her own grief. You did this yourself, she asked when she trusted her voice again. You wrote the letter and held the gun and waited to see if I would come. I promised him I would, Thomas said simply. He was my father's friend, and he'd done right by my family when he didn't have to. Keeping his things and making sure his daughter knew what kind of man he was, that seemed like the least I could do. Pauline looked at him for a long moment. In the morning light, she could see that his face was more expressive than she'd initially thought. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, and his mouth had a natural seriousness that broke into something warmer when he was being direct. He was a man of considered words, she thought. He didn't say things he didn't mean. How long are you planning to stay in Caldwell? He asked. I bought a return ticket for the end of the week, she said. I wasn't certain how long the business would take. Would you be willing to stay the full week? She raised an eyebrow. He didn't flush or stumble. He met her gaze steadily. I'd like to show you the land, he said. The piece my father left me that your father kept safe. I think you should see what it became. I think your father would have wanted you to see it. It was a reasonable request. She told herself it was only a reasonable request. "All right," she said, "I can stay the week." The town of Caldwell in those years was a place caught between two eras, which was true of most frontier cattle towns in 1883. The cattle trade had peaked and was beginning its slow decline as the railroads pushed further south, and the ranges began to be fenced in by the homesteaders, whose wire was slowly changing the face of the open country. There were still drovers and cowboys filling the streets on weekends, still the dust and noise and energy of a place that had not yet decided what it was going to be when it grew up. But there was also a new church going up on the south end of town, and a schoolhouse being expanded, and a women's reading society that met on Thursday evenings at the back of the dry goods store. Thomas showed her the town on Monday, walking beside her with his hat in his hand when they were on the wooden sidewalks, and back on his head when they stepped into the street. He introduced her to Earl Hadson, who was indeed not much for letters but was a bearish, good-natured man with a handshake like a vice and kind eyes, and to the woman who ran the dry goods store, a widow named Clara Briggs who had come west from Ohio much the way Pauline's own family had, and who treated Pauline with the immediate warm familiarity of someone who recognizes a kindred circumstance. "Ohio," Clara said, with a look of genuine pleasure. "Columbus or Cleveland?" "Outside Columbus," Pauline said. "I was outside Cleveland," Clara said. "Lord, isn't that something? And now here we are in Kansas. You should come to the Reading Society Thursday if you're still in town." Pauline said she might. She caught Thomas watching her with that careful, attentive quality he seemed to have around her, like he was paying close attention not in the way of surveillance, but in the way of someone who finds a thing genuinely interesting. They had lunch at the restaurant where Mrs. Gruber served her excellent coffee, and Thomas told her about the drives, the Kishom Trail, the Red River crossing that was the most nerve-wracking part of any push north, the way the sky in Texas looked at night when you were far from any town, and the stars pressed down so close you felt you could reach up and rearrange them. He told her about the cattle and the dogs and the other drovers, and he told her about her father with the easy affection of a man who had genuinely liked someone, and Pauline ate her food and listened and felt her father becoming more real to her than he had been in years. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked at one point. "With the shop with Chicago, is that where you intend to stay?" "I don't know," Pauline said, which surprised her because she had always known exactly what she intended. "My mother is gone, and the shop is doing well enough that I could hire someone to run it, but it's always been our family's shop, and it feels like letting go of something." "Sometimes letting go of something is just making room," Thomas said. She looked at him. "That's a very philosophical thing to say for a cattle rancher." "I had a lot of time alone on the drives," he said, and that almost smile was there again. "A man thinks." They rode out to the Lockhart land on Tuesday, which required Pauline to be fitted with borrowed riding clothes from Clara Briggs, because she had not packed for equestrian activities, and which also required her to admit to Thomas that her riding experience was limited to a single summer as a girl when her father had taught her on a neighbor's horse. "Then we'll go slowly," Thomas said, without a trace of condescension in it, just simple practical adjustment, and he helped her mount a gentle roan mare named Biscuit without making her feel either helpless or embarrassed, which she appreciated enormously. The 40 miles was not ridden in a single day. They rode out to a waypoint where a neighboring rancher named Phelan kept a place where travelers could stop, spent the night there in separate arrangements that were perfectly proper, and rode the remaining distance the next morning. She had not spent this much time in the open air in years. The prairie was doing something to her that she didn't quite have words for, loosening things, expanding something in her chest, making the Chicago life feel very small and very far away. The sky was immense and the grass was spring green and the wind smelled of dirt and growth and possibility, and Biscuit was a steady, reliable horse who seemed to forgive her imperfect riding with good nature. Thomas rode beside her and slightly ahead when the trail was narrow, and she found herself watching the easy competence with which he handled his horse, the unhurried way he moved through this landscape as if he belonged to it completely. He had grown up partly in Texas and partly in San Antonio and partly on the trail itself, he told her, after his mother had remarried a good man who had taught Thomas everything he knew about cattle. He had come to Kansas because of the land deed and stayed because the land itself had gotten into him. "Can a place do that?" she asked. "Get into a person?" "Can't it?" he said, and gestured at the prairie around them, and she understood what he meant. They arrived at the Lockhart property in the late morning of Wednesday, and what Pauline saw made her stop Biscuit at the low rise that overlooked the land and simply take it in. It was not a grand ranch. It was an honest ranch, a solid log house with a good roof and a covered porch, a barn that was well maintained and larger than the house, and beyond the barn a spread of grazing land where she could see cattle moving like dark punctuation marks across the green text of the grass. There were young cottonwood trees planted along the south side of the house, not yet large enough to give much shade but clearly put there with the long view in mind, and there was a kitchen garden being turned along the east wall. "It's beautiful," Pauline said, and meant it without any of the hedging she usually applied to her opinions. Thomas looked at the land with an expression she could only describe as tender. "My father never saw it," he said. "He died before he could even survey it properly, but he chose it somehow. I've never understood exactly how he knew this piece would be worth having, but he was right." "He was friends with a man who turned out to be worth having too," Pauline said, and then wondered why she'd said it that way. Thomas turned to look at her. The morning light was full on his face, and he was not guarding his expression the way she'd seen him do sometimes. And what she saw there made her heart do something she hadn't expected at all. "Your father told me once," Thomas said slowly, "that his daughter had more sense than any 3 men he'd ever met, and that he was sorry he hadn't been around more to see it grow." Pauline looked away at the cottonwood trees. "He should have come back," she said. "He should have come back when my mother was sick." "Yes," Thomas said, "he should have." He didn't try to excuse it or explain it away, and that honesty, the plain acknowledgement that her father had failed in something real, was more comforting than any justification could have been. They dismounted, and he showed her the house, which was clean and spare and had clearly been lived in by a man alone. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace. She was surprised to find books and then felt guilty for being surprised. There was a photograph on the mantel of a man she didn't know but whose resemblance to Thomas was unmistakable. "Your father," she said. "Samuel Lockhart," Thomas said. "That was taken in San Antonio about a year before he died. My mother kept it for years and then gave it to me when I came north." She studied the photograph, the same jaw, the same straight posture, the same quality of solidity in the stance. "He looks like a man who kept his word," she said. "He was," Thomas said, "and he picked friends who kept theirs." They had lunch on the porch because the day was warm enough for it, and Thomas made coffee and produced bread and canned beans and dried meat that was more palatable than it sounds when you've ridden for 2 days, and the open air has given you an appetite. They ate and talked about everything and nothing. The reading society Clara Briggs ran, what Thomas thought about the Kansas legislature's approach to the cattle trade, whether Chicago in winter was as miserable as people from outside it always seemed to believe. "It is," Pauline confirmed. "It is precisely as miserable as advertised. And yet you stayed. Where else would I have gone?" He looked at her over his coffee cup and said nothing, and the silence had a particular quality to it that made her fingers tighten slightly on her own cup. She walked the perimeter of the property in the afternoon, while Thomas did the necessary work that a ranch required regardless of who was visiting, feeding the cattle at the watering point, checking the fencing on the east side where a post had been giving him trouble. She followed along for part of it, not out of obligation, but because she found she wanted to understand how this place worked, how all its pieces fit together into a whole. "You do all of this alone?" she asked, watching him reset the fence post with the efficient movements of a man who has done this particular task many times. Mostly, he said. I hire day help from Caldwell for the heavy work. I've got a hand named Jose who comes in for 2 weeks every other month. Good man, knows cattle better than I do. He paused. It would be better with more people. Most things are. Yes, she said, looking at the post going firmly back into the earth under his hands. Most things are. That evening they sat on the porch after supper. He had cooked, which she hadn't expected, a reasonable beef stew with biscuits from a recipe. He said his mother had sent him written on a piece of newspaper, and watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie. The sky went through colors that Pauline did not have adequate names for, rose and amber, and a deep red that darkened at the edges into something almost purple, and then the stars came out in numbers she had never seen from a city vast and immediate and humbling. I understand now, she said. What you said about the stars pressing close. Your father loved this sky, Thomas said. He said it was the one thing about being West that made it all worth it. She pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. Tell me something else about him that I wouldn't know. Thomas thought about it for a moment. He was sitting on the porch steps, one arm resting on his knee, and the starlight was enough to see his face by. He could whistle anything, he said. Any tune he'd heard even once, he could whistle it perfectly. The other drovers would hum something once and he'd have it. He used to whistle to the cattle at night when they were restless. He said it was a trick his father had taught him. Pauline laughed, a genuine, sudden laugh that surprised her and seemed to surprise Thomas too. I remember that, she said. He used to whistle in the mornings while he made coffee. My mother always said she could tell what mood he was in by what he was whistling. What did the good mood sound like? Church hymns, usually, Pauline said. He wasn't a church-going man particularly, but he'd grown up with the music and it was deep in him. Thomas nodded slowly. I've heard that about certain things. They go in when you're young and they never come out. What went in when you were young? She asked, and then felt immediately as if she'd asked something too personal. But he answered without hesitation. Promise, he said. My father talked about it all the time. He said a man's word was the one thing no circumstance could take from him unless he gave it away. I was 14 when he died, and that was the main thing I had left of him, that idea. Promise means something. You make it, you keep it. She watched his profile against the stars. And you've lived by that. I've tried to, she said after a moment. My father kept his promise to your father. He did, Thomas said quietly. For 4 years with no one watching when it would have been easy not to. That's the only kind of promise that counts, I think. The ones you keep when no one's looking. They rode back to Caldwell on Thursday, arriving by late afternoon, and Pauline attended the reading society that evening at Clara Briggs's back room, which turned out to be 6 women of varying ages discussing a novel by Louisa May Alcott with the engaged passion of people who took stories seriously. She enjoyed it more than she'd expected. She found herself thinking about it afterward, lying in the hotel bed, thinking about the women and the conversation and the reading society and Clara's warm back room, and the way the town had a texture to it that she hadn't anticipated from a cattle town in Kansas. She also thought about Thomas Lockhart, which was becoming a habit she was not sure she wanted to break. He came to find her the next morning before she'd finished breakfast, appearing in the doorway of Mrs. Gruber's restaurant with his hat in his hand, and an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of uncertainty, the one where he'd clearly been thinking about something for long enough that he'd worked himself into a corner. Sit down, she said, because she could see he was going to stand there being uncertain for an unproductive amount of time. Have coffee. He sat. Mrs. Gruber materialized with a cup and gave Pauline a look of such pointed significance that Pauline chose not to meet it. Your train is tomorrow, Thomas said. Yes. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I want to ask you something, and I want to say first that you are under no obligation whatsoever to answer in any particular direction, and that whatever you say, I meant everything I told you this week, and I don't take any of it back. Thomas, she said. Yes. Just ask. He looked at her directly, and there it was again, that unguarded quality, the October water eyes not hiding anything at all. Is there anything about Caldwell or about the land or about— He stopped. Is there any reason you can think of that would make you consider staying? Not forever necessarily, just a while longer. It was not, technically, a declaration. But it was not quite only a question about the town, either. She considered him across the table. She thought about Chicago, about the millinery shop with its familiar smells of ribbon and straw and the particular damp that came off Lake Michigan in the cold months. She thought about her mother's hands, and her father's whistle, and the package of papers that had been kept safe for 4 years by a man who kept his promises. She thought about the stars last night over the Kansas prairie and the way the light went through colors that had no adequate names. I could look into finding a manager for the shop, she said carefully. Someone to run it while I make some decisions. He was very still. That would take some time, he said. It would. And in the meantime, she said, I would need a good reason to stay in Caldwell, something to occupy my time and skills while the decisions are being made. Clara Briggs has been saying for a year that she'd like someone to help with the reading society, he said, and the school could use a teacher's aide, I've heard. Those are fine things, she said. Are there any other reasons? He looked at her steadily for a long moment. The morning sun was coming through the restaurant window, and it caught the dust motes in the air between them and made them look like something deliberate, like a thing the world had arranged. There is one more reason, he said, but I'm aware I've only known you for 4 days, and I don't want to say something that frightens you off before you've had a chance to consider the others. I don't frighten easily, Pauline said. You should have gathered that by now. I have gathered exactly that, he said, which is part of the reason. Part of the reason for what? He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with complete frankness. I would very much like to keep knowing you, Pauline Alden. I would like the time to do it properly. That is the other reason. She let the sentence settle in the air between them. She felt it landing, felt the warmth of it finding a place in her chest where it fit, and she thought that a person could spend a lifetime waiting for something that felt this uncomplicated and real and still be surprised when it arrived. I'll write to Chicago about the shop today, she said. She watched something shift in his face, relief and pleasure, and something tender and careful, held with both hands like something he didn't want to spill. I'm glad, he said simply. Don't be smug about it, she said. The almost smile became a real one then, full and sudden, and it changed his face completely. I am not remotely smug, he said. I am, however, extremely glad. She extended her stay at the Drover's Rest for another 2 weeks while she wrote letters and waited for responses. And in those 2 weeks, she learned Caldwell the way you learn a thing when you are paying close attention. She helped Clara Briggs with the Reading Society and began, tentatively, to help the schoolteacher Miss Evans on mornings when the class was large. She walked the streets and learned who lived where and what everyone did, and the particular social geography of a frontier town in the Kansas of 1883, which was more complex than outsiders expected. She also spent time with Thomas Lockhart, which was easy in the way that spending time with certain people is easy. Not effortless exactly, because there was the normal work of learning someone, but easy in the sense that it felt like moving in the right direction. They walked together in the evenings and ate meals together and talked about everything. His plans for the land, her thoughts about the shop, what they had each read and thought and wondered about. He told her about his mother in San Antonio, a sharp, warm woman named Georgia who had rebuilt her life after Samuel Lockhart's death with a determination Thomas clearly admired. Pauline told him about her mother's hands and the millinery and about growing up in Ohio and what it had been like to have a father who was half legend and half absence. I'm angry at him, she said one evening, surprising herself. They were walking along the edge of town where the wooden sidewalk ended and the prairie just began, and the evening air was mild and full of the smells of spring. I know I shouldn't be now that he's gone, but I am. You can be both things, Thomas said. Angry and sad, they don't cancel each other out. He was a good man, she said. Everyone who knew him seems to know that. You knew that, and he was still not there. No, Thomas said. He wasn't. He walked beside her in silence for a moment. I think some people love big and live small. The feeling is enormous and the action is inadequate, and they know it, and they don't know what to do about the gap, so they just stay in it. She looked at him, and other people try to make the action equal the feeling, he said. Try being the relevant word. Which kind are you? He met her gaze. I'm trying to be the second kind, he said. She looked away at the prairie, at the last light going off the grass in waves of gold. I know, she said. I can see that. The response from Chicago came sooner than she'd expected. Her assistant at the shop, a capable young woman named Ruth Hands, had written back within days of receiving Pauline's letter, and the letter was businesslike and efficient, and indicated very clearly that Ruth was entirely capable of managing the shop in Pauline's absence, and also, reading between the lines, that she had been hoping for exactly this opportunity for some time. There was a second letter from Pauline's landlady, confirming that the apartment could be held or sublet as Pauline wished. She read both letters in the morning light of her hotel room, and felt something that it took her a moment to identify as freedom. Not the freedom of having nothing, but the specific freedom of having something and choosing to set it down voluntarily. She told Thomas about the letters over dinner that evening at a restaurant that was slightly grander than Mrs. Gruber's, with actual tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard. She had suggested they celebrate the decision, and he had agreed with an alacrity that made her smile. So you're staying, he said. I'm staying for now, she said. I have conditions. Of course you do, he said, and the warmth in it was something she was beginning to think she could get used to. I want to be useful, she said. I don't intend to simply sit at the hotel indefinitely. I'd like to actually do something, the reading society, the school, perhaps something of my own eventually. I have skills with numbers and with managing inventory and with the business side of things. I'd like to use them. Clara Briggs has been trying to get her accounts in order for a year, Thomas said. She's a good shopkeeper, but she hates the ledgers. I imagine she'd be grateful. I can do that, Pauline said. And I'd like to spend more time at the school. Miss Evans would be glad of it. And I'd like to come out to the ranch again, she said. Not just once. I'd like to understand it properly. He looked at her across the tablecloth and the candle between them, and there was something in his expression that made her fingers go warm. You can come out as often as you like, he said. The mayor likes you. Biscuit is a very good judge of character. High praise, she said. Being approved by a horse. In my experience, absolutely it is. She laughed, and he laughed too, and across the restaurant 2 older men looked over at them and looked at each other with the knowing expressions of people who recognize a thing that is moving toward its proper conclusion. Pauline did not move out to the ranch. She stayed at the Drover's Rest and then, in May, moved into a small room that Clara Briggs rented out above the dry goods store, which was more economical and more comfortable, and also placed her at the social center of the town, in a way the hotel had not. She established herself quickly. There was something in her Chicago directness and her head for practical matters that the community responded to. And by the end of May, she had Clara's accounts sorted and was helping Miss Evans 3 mornings a week, and had taken over the organization of the Reading Society completely, expanding it from 6 members to 11. She and Thomas continued to see each other, and the seeing each other gradually changed in texture as the weeks went by, becoming something more intimate and explicit without either of them having made a formal announcement. He began bringing her wildflowers, prairie wildflowers, rough and vivid, not the cultivated kind, and she began cooking for him occasionally in the kitchen Clara allowed her to use, learning the particular adjustments required when cooking over a wood stove for a man with a working appetite. He took her riding 2 or 3 times a week, and she got better at it, and Biscuit remained approvingly steady under her, and the prairie began to feel like something she understood rather than something she was observing. One evening in early June, they were sitting on the steps of the dry goods store after Clara had closed up for the night, watching the street go quiet in the blue dusk, and Thomas took her hand. Not dramatically, not with preamble, just reached over and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while without speaking. "I think about the future quite a lot these days," he said finally. "Do you?" she said. Her thumb had found the callus on the side of his palm from the fence wire, and she was tracing it in a way she hoped was not too forward. "I do," he said. "I think about the house and what it could be with more than one person in it. I think about the cottonwood trees getting big enough to shade the porch. I think about what the land could grow into over the next 20 years. Those are good things to think about," she said. "I also think about you," he said, "in the context of all those things." She was quiet for a moment. The street had gone mostly dark, and the stars were beginning to appear in the strip of sky between the buildings. "I think about them too," she said. In the same context. He turned to look at her, and in the evening light his face was very close and very serious and very open. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to do it properly when the time is right. But I want you to know right now that I am moving toward a question, and I wanted to be transparent about that because I think you're the kind of person who appreciates knowing which direction things are moving." She laughed softly. "You are very considerate," she said. "I'm very serious," he said, "about you specifically." "I know," she said. "I'm also serious about you specifically." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, an old-fashioned gesture that should have seemed formal, but instead felt like the most direct thing anyone had ever done to her. "Good," he said. "That's very good." Summer came to the Kansas prairie with force, hot, insistent, sky-filling summer that Pauline found overwhelming and magnificent in equal measure. The cattle on the Lockhart land were fat, and the grass was tall, and the watering point was strong. And Thomas threw himself into the season's work with a focus that she recognized as purposeful, as if he were building towards something and was measuring his progress carefully. There were challenges, as there always were on any working land. A fence line came down in a storm in late June, and a section of the herd got mixed in with Phelan's cattle from the neighboring property, which required a day of sorting work that Thomas and his part-time hand Jose handled together with the efficient good humor of men, accustomed to the unpredictability of animals. Pauline happened to be at the ranch that day, and she watched from the fence and asked questions and learned things about cattle that she had not previously known were things she wanted to learn. And she helped where she could, filling the water trough, bringing food to the men at midday, and Jose, who was a lean and weathered man in his 30s with quick dark eyes and a dry sense of humor, gave her an appraising look at the end of the day and said to Thomas in a tone of considered approval, "She does not stand around." "No," Thomas agreed, looking at Pauline with that expression she was beginning to think of as specifically for her. "She does not." She felt she had been paid a high compliment. July brought a heat that pressed down like a physical weight, and the town moved slower in it, and the evenings became precious for the slight cooling they brought. Pauline found that the heat suited something in her that the Chicago winters had always suppressed. She liked being warm, she discovered, liked the long, slow evenings on Clara's upper porch with a glass of cold well water and a book in her lap. She wrote long letters to Ruth in Chicago and shorter ones to a few old friends, and the letters were full of the prairie and the town and the people she was learning, and they were, she realized only after she'd sent several of them, nearly full of Thomas Lockhart. He asked her on a Saturday evening in late July. They had ridden out to the ranch that afternoon and had supper on the porch as the day cooled, and afterward he had walked her out to where the cottonwood trees were planted, and they had stood there in the evening light with the prairie spreading away in every direction, gold and vast, and he had turned to face her with his whole heart visible in his face. "Pauline," he said, "I want to ask you to be my wife." She had known it was coming, he had told her it was coming, in his characteristically transparent way, but knowing it was coming and having it arrive were two entirely different things, and she felt the weight of it land in her chest with an accuracy that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "I love you," he said. I know that's meant to come first before the question. I just wanted to say it plainly. I love you, and I would like to spend the rest of my life making that something you can rely on." She looked at him, his honest face, his steady hands, the way he was standing with his whole self committed to this moment, not hedging, not retreating, not leaving a door open behind him. She thought about her father who had loved her mother and loved her and had left. She thought about Samuel Lockhart, who had trusted a friend with the most important thing he owned. She thought about promise, what Thomas had said about it on the porch that first night, about how you keep it when no one's looking. This man would keep it, she thought. She was as certain of that as she had ever been of anything. "Yes," she said, "I will be your wife." He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for longer than this conversation, as if he had been holding it for weeks. He took her face in his hands with the most careful, gentle grip she had ever felt, and kissed her under the Kansas evening sky with the cottonwood trees standing witness, and the prairie went on forever around them, and the stars began. They were married in October of 1883, in the new church on the south end of Caldwell, on a cool, clear day when the sky was the particular deep blue of the Kansas fall. Clara Briggs organized the women of the Reading Society into a decoration committee, and the church was filled with dried prairie flowers and cut pine boughs, and Mrs. Gruber provided the wedding cake with the air of a woman who considered this partly her own achievement. Pauline wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had made herself. Her millinery training had given her excellent sewing skills, and carried a small bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season that Thomas had found somewhere remarkable given the time of year. He stood at the front of the church in a clean dark suit that fit him well and looked at her, as she came down the aisle with an expression of such absolute and uncomplicated love that 3 women in the congregation cried without any apology. Earl Hadson stood with Thomas, having agreed to the role of best man with the gruff, pleased manner of a man who is more sentimental than he usually lets on. Miss Evans sat in the front pew and took charge of Clara Briggs's handkerchief when Clara required it. Pauline walked down that aisle with her father's Colt revolver in its holster, hanging from the end of the pew nearest the front, because she had asked for it to be there, and Thomas had not asked why, but had simply made sure it was arranged. She wanted her father to be present in whatever way he could be, and the gun was his presence. The solid, practical, kept safe presence of a man who had loved imperfectly and kept his word completely. The minister was a gentle man named Reverend Abel who had come west from Pennsylvania and still seemed slightly awed by the openness of everything, and he read the vows with genuine feeling. And Thomas said his with the same directness he brought to everything, looking straight at her, every word landing with full intention. When he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother George's, sent from San Antonio with a letter of such warmth that Pauline had cried reading it, she felt something complete itself in her, some long open circuit closing. They moved out to the ranch together that same week, which she had already made a home of in her mind, if not yet in fact. She brought her trunk and her books and a length of good blue curtain fabric she'd bought from Clara, and she hung the curtains in the bedroom and put the books on the shelf beside his books and placed her father's gun on the mantel next to the photograph of Samuel Lockhart. They belonged there together, she thought. 2 fathers, 2 keepers of promises, watching over the life that their friendship had eventually made possible. Thomas saw her put the gun there and stood for a moment looking at it. Then he reached over and moved the photograph a few inches so it was directly beside the gun, and the 2 objects stood together on the mantel like a sentence, like something said and answered. "All right," he said, in the tone of a man who has put a thing in its right place. "Yes," she said, "all right." The life they built was not a simple one, but it was a good one, and it had the texture of a thing made by 2 people paying attention. Pauline took over the accounting for the ranch alongside what she was already doing in town, and she discovered that she had strong opinions about the management of land and cattle that were frequently right, and that Thomas received without defensiveness. integrating them into his thinking with the pragmatic openness of a man who is secure enough to be corrected. They argued sometimes. She was direct and he was stubborn on certain points, and occasionally these qualities collided with some force. But they argued like people who respected each other, which meant the arguments were more honest than they were hurtful, and they ended with resolution rather than distance. Jose continued to come for his 2-week stretches and became fond of them both, particularly of Pauline's cooking, which had improved dramatically since the days of the boarding house experiments. And he brought his wife Alina along one spring, and the four of them had a dinner on the porch that lasted past midnight and produced a friendship that would last for years. Georgia Lockhart came to visit in the spring of 1884, making the journey from San Antonio on the train, with the determination of a woman who had waited long enough to meet her daughter-in-law in person. She was exactly as Thomas had described her, sharp and warm, with quick eyes that saw everything and a manner of speaking that was direct without being harsh, and she arrived at the ranch and looked around at the house and the barn and the cottonwood trees and the cattle and then looked at Pauline and said, "Well, he did all right, didn't he?" It was not entirely clear whether she meant Thomas or Samuel, and Pauline suspected she meant both. "He did," Pauline said. Georgia stayed for a month, and in that month she and Pauline established the particular friendship that is sometimes possible between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law when they are both practical, direct people who love the same man for complementary reasons. Georgia taught her things about Thomas that only his mother could know, the ways he went quiet when he was worried, the fact that he had always had difficulty accepting help from others, the particular kind of stubborn that was inherited from Samuel and had to be approached from the side rather than head-on. Pauline received all of this as the gift it was. In June of 1884, Pauline told Thomas she was expecting a child. He received this news in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with his coffee halfway to his mouth, and then he set the coffee down very carefully on the table and came around the table and put both arms around her with a gentleness that was not his usual mode of affection, which ran more to the solid and confident, and he held her for a long time without saying anything at all. "All right?" she asked against his shoulder. "More than all right," he said, his voice rough in a way that meant something. "I just need a moment." She gave him the moment. They had a son in February of 1885. He was born in the bedroom of the ranch house with a midwife who came out from Caldwell and stayed 2 days, and he was born healthy and loud, with a quantity of dark hair and a determined expression that the midwife said was unusual in newborns, and that Georgia, contacted by letter with indecent speed, wrote back to say was exactly what Thomas had looked like at 30 minutes old. They named him Samuel Jeremiah Lockhart, which was Thomas's idea, and which Pauline agreed to before he'd finished saying it. Samuel for Thomas's father, Jeremiah for hers. 2 men who had trusted each other, honored in the name of a son, who would grow up knowing that trust was the foundation of things worth keeping. Pauline stood by the bedroom window the night after Samuel was born, wrapped in a heavy shawl while the February wind pressed against the glass, and looked at her son sleeping in his cradle, the cradle Thomas had made himself, working on it in the evenings for the last 2 months of the pregnancy with a focus that she had understood was love expressed in wood and joinery, and she felt her father there in the room with her. Not as grief, exactly, as completion. As the understanding that the distance he had kept and the promise he had honored had both led to this house, this man asleep in the next room, this child, this life. He had not been present in the way she'd needed him to be, but he had been faithful in the way that mattered to the story, and the story had led here. She went to the mantel and put her hand on the Colt revolver, just for a moment. Then she went back to bed. Spring came to the Lockhart ranch with Samuel growing rapidly and loudly, and with great enthusiasm for everything that came within reach of his hands. The cottonwood trees had grown noticeably in the 2 years since Pauline had first seen them, and they were beginning to offer real shade on the porch in the afternoons, fulfilling the long intention they'd been planted with. The cattle herd had grown too, and Thomas had taken on a second regular hand and was beginning to talk carefully about expanding the east pasture. The Reading Society in Caldwell had grown to 17 members by that spring and had begun holding a quarterly lecture series to which they invited speakers from Wichita and occasionally from as far as Kansas City, which caused a minor sensation the first time it happened. Pauline organized these events with the precise, cheerful competence that characterized everything she put her hand to, and they were generally acknowledged to be the most interesting thing happening in Caldwell on the given evening. She also, in the spring of 1885, made a decision about the millinery shop in Chicago. Ruth Hands had been running it well for nearly 2 years, and Pauline had been watching the accounts carefully, and she called Ruth's ownership of the shop a fair price and sold it to her. The shop had been her mother's and her own, and it was being kept in good hands, and it was time to let it go entirely and belong completely to the life she was living now. She wrote Ruth a letter saying so, and Ruth wrote back a letter of gratitude so heartfelt it made Pauline cry a little, and that was that. She told Thomas that evening, and he listened and then said, "How do you feel?" "Like I set something down," she said, "and my hands are free." "Good," he said, with his hand warm on her back. "I can think of several good uses for free hands on a working ranch." "I'm sure you can," she said. They had begun talking, in that easy way of people who have established the grammar of their future together, about what the ranch would be in 5 years and 10, about whether they would add a schoolroom because the children of the neighboring properties also needed schooling, and the ride to Caldwell was too long for small ones, about what the Reading Society would look like when it had the meeting room Thomas had offered to build onto the side of the dry goods store. In the fall of 1886, Pauline found herself expecting again, and this time she told Thomas at dinner with Samuel banging cheerfully on the table with a spoon, and Thomas put his face in his hands for a moment and then looked up with the expression of a man who is being given more than he thought he deserved and knows it. "Samuel is going to need a sibling," Pauline said. "He is," Thomas agreed. "He is entirely too pleased with himself as an only child." "This is perhaps the pot commenting on the kettle," she said. He laughed. "I was not pleased with myself. I was alone. There is a difference." "A fine line," she said. The second child was a girl, born in May of 1887 on a warm evening with the windows open, and the prairie smell coming in on the breeze, and Samuel being managed by Elena, Hosea's wife, in the kitchen with considerable patience. She was smaller than Samuel had been and quieter, with Pauline's dark hair and Thomas's October eyes, and she was named Georgia Me Lockhart for Thomas's mother, and for the month of spring. And when Georgia Sr. was informed by letter, she wrote back a response so emotional, it covered 4 pages, and arrived with what appeared to be dried rose petals pressed between the sheets, which was so uncharacteristic of the practical Georgia Lockhart that Thomas read the letter twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. Samuel was enormously interested in his new sister, and was also not entirely sure she was an improvement on the previous arrangement, which was honest if not gracious, and he spent the first week of her life regarding her with the evaluating expression of a small boy determining whether something is actually useful. He was eventually won over by the fact that she would close her fingers around his when he offered his hand, which he found remarkable. Thomas held his daughter on the porch in the May evening light and looked at her with an expression Pauline watched from the doorway and did not interrupt. She recognized it. She had seen variations of it on his face when he looked at the land, or at Samuel, or at her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was the expression of a man who has been surprised by how much a thing means and is trying to hold it carefully. "Samuel, Jeremiah, and Georgia Me," he said when Pauline came to stand beside him. "That's a lot of name for such a small family." "We're not a small family," she said, leaning against his arm. "No," he said, "we're not." The years that followed were the substance of the life they had promised each other, and they had the rich, detailed texture of real years rather than the smooth surface of idealized ones. There were hard seasons and good ones. A drought in 1888 that tested the ranch and everyone on it, but that they came through by the combination of careful saving and the stubborn refusal to give up that was, Jose said, absolutely characteristic of both Lockharts equally. There was a difficult winter that put Pauline in bed with a lung complaint for 3 weeks, and put Thomas in a state of controlled terror that he expressed by cooking the most elaborate meals he had ever attempted and sitting with her in the evenings, reading aloud from the books on the shelf while she recovered. Samuel grew into a boy who had his father's solidity and his mother's sharp attention, and his grandfather Jeremiah's ability to whistle any tune he heard even once, which came out of him one morning so unexpectedly that Pauline went still and put her hand over her mouth, and then laughed and cried in the same moment. And Thomas came in to find her in this state and put his arm around her, and she said, "He has my father's whistle," and Thomas held her for a long time. Georgia grew into a girl of quick intelligence and strong opinions who had, by the age of 4, determined that horses were the most important thing in the world, and that she intended to ride better than anyone, and had set about this goal with a purposefulness that was entirely characteristic of both her parents. Thomas started her lessons on a small, steady pony called Clover, and she was on Clover every morning before breakfast with a dedication that made Jose shake his head and say she was already better than most of the drovers he'd worked with, which was possibly an exaggeration, but not by as much as it might seem. The schoolroom Thomas had talked about was built onto the south side of the ranch house in 1889, after 2 more families with children had settled nearby, and the need had become pressing. Pauline ran it 3 mornings a week. A proper little school with a proper little chalkboard and proper little desks built by Thomas and Jose over the course of a winter, and 5 children including Samuel and Georgia who arrived on their horses and left on their horses and carried their primers with the seriousness of people engaged in important work, which Pauline made very sure they understood they were. Miss Evans, who was still teaching in Caldwell and had become one of Pauline's closest friends, came out twice a month to help with the older lessons, making the ride out from town on a good bay horse with a bag of books across the pommel, and arriving in time for the morning class. She had married Earl Hadson the previous spring, which surprised everyone who didn't know them well and no one who did, and she was increasingly of the opinion that this part of Kansas was developing something real. It was, Pauline thought it was. The Reading Society grew, and the lecture series became an institution, and Clara Briggs's dry goods store expanded twice, and eventually included a lending library occupying the back room where the society had begun, which Pauline organized and cataloged with the same satisfaction she had once applied to ledgers. Clara herself remained one of the constants of Pauline's Kansas life, the woman who had recognized a kindred spirit in the first week and had never let her forget it. In the autumn of 1890, Thomas's mother Georgia came for another visit, this time bringing her second husband James, a retired schoolteacher from San Antonio who was quiet and observant and immediately taken with the ranch and with Samuel and Georgia, in whom he recognized pupils worth teaching. He spent the visit engaged in long conversations with both children that Samuel reported at dinner each evening, with the detailed enthusiasm of a boy discovering that adults can be interesting, and Georgia drew him into debates about horses versus mathematics in which she allowed him no quarter. Thomas watched his mother in the kitchen with Pauline one evening and then came to stand next to her where she was leaning against the door frame watching the same scene, and he put his arm around her waist and rested his chin against her hair. "She loves you," he said. "I love her," Pauline said. "She told me this morning you're the best thing that ever happened to this family," he said. Her exact words. Pauline considered this. "I would argue that you're the best thing that ever happened to this family," she said. "Given that you are in fact the one who kept the promise and wrote the letter and waited to see if anyone would come." "You came," he said. "I came for a gun," she said. "And stayed for everything else," she said. He turned her to face him there in the doorway, with the sound of Georgia Lockhart Sr. arguing cheerfully with Pauline about the correct way to season a stew, and he kissed his wife in the autumn evening light with the same focused intention he had brought to everything in their life together, and she kissed him back with equal intention, and they stood like that for a long enough moment that Samuel walked past and made a noise of enormous theatrical disgust. "We are being embarrassing," Thomas said against her temple. "Frequently," she agreed. The gun on the mantel stayed where Pauline had put it on the first day she moved in, and over the years it became a piece of the house the way all the loved things do, noticed by visitors and commented on. Known to the children as the gun that belonged to the grandfather they had never met but who was present in certain essential ways. Samuel asked about it at age 7 with the directness of small boys, and Pauline sat with him on the porch and told him the story, the whole story, the letter from Caldwell and the train journey and the gun and the promise that had been kept for 4 years in the dark. And Samuel listened with complete attention and then was quiet for a long moment and said, "So grandfather kept a secret for Thomas's father?" "He did," Pauline said. "And Thomas kept grandfather's gun?" "He did." "And then you married Thomas?" "I did." Samuel thought about this with the concentrated consideration he brought to important things. "So we're all kind of connected," he said, "all the way back." "Yes," she said. "All the way back." Samuel Jeremiah Lockhart grew into a young man who had his grandfather Jeremiah's whistle, and his grandmother George's practicality, and his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and who went to proper school in Wichita at 15, and came back at 18 with ideas about land management and water conservation that Thomas received with the same pragmatic openness he always brought to being corrected by people he trusted, and which turned out to be substantially right. Georgia Me Lockhart grew into a young woman who rode better than almost anyone in the county, which had been her ambition since age 4, and which she achieved with the methodical seriousness of someone who sets goals and keeps them, which was her mother in miniature. She was 20 in 1907, and had strong ideas about horses and equally strong ideas about most other things, and she had a young man from the neighboring Felland property who was worthy of her, which was a judgment Thomas made carefully, and Pauline confirmed, and Samuel communicated with brotherly bluntness, and which the young man bore with admirable patience. In the spring of 1891, Pauline had a third child, a boy they named James Thomas Lockhart, for George's quiet husband and for Thomas himself, and James Thomas was from his first month a child of determined cheerfulness who seemed to find everything genuinely interesting, including the things that were not, and who grew up to be the most socially gifted of the 3 Lockhart children, and the one most likely to be found in the middle of any gathering of any kind, explaining something with great enthusiasm. By 1895, the Lockhart Ranch was one of the established properties of the southern Kansas country, not the largest and not the wealthiest but known and respected, the kind of place that people in the territory recognized as solid. The cottonwood trees Thomas had planted with the long view in mind were now tall enough to shade the entire south side of the house in summer, giving the porch the deep, cool shade he had been working toward since before Pauline arrived, and the house itself had been expanded twice: a sitting room, a larger kitchen, an additional bedroom for the children who had all at various points arrived, and had the comfortable layered look of a house that is added to with love over many years. Pauline stood on that porch one morning in September of 1895, with the full Kansas summer just turning toward autumn, and the light going golden the way she had learned to love it in 12 years of Kansas autumns. And she drank her coffee and watched the cattle in the far pasture, and listened to the sound of Georgia arguing with James Thomas about something through an open window, and Samuel's voice cutting in with the measured tone of an older brother who is trying to be fair, and Thomas coming around the corner of the barn wiping his hands on a cloth and looking up at the porch and seeing her and lifting one hand in the particular wave that was just for her, unhurried and warm and full of everything. She thought about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1883. She thought about the train platform in Chicago and the gray traveling hat and the folded letter soft at its folds. She thought about the gun in her hands in the sheriff's office, heavy and real, and the man who had stood up when she came in because he was very well-mannered and not trying to impress anyone. She thought about promise, what it meant to keep it, what it made possible when it was kept. She waved back. Thomas came up the porch steps and took the coffee cup from her hand and had a sip with the comfortable familiarity of 11 years of marriage, and then gave it back and leaned against the porch rail looking at the same thing she'd been looking at: the morning land, the cattle, the far grass, the enormous sky. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They stood together in the good light with the sounds of their children inside and the prairie spreading away in every direction. And all the threads of the thing they had built were gathered here in this moment: two fathers, two promises, two people who had found each other at the end of a kept word, and the morning was clear and the autumn was coming and there was nothing unresolved, nothing left hanging, nothing left to wait for. Everything had been found. Everything had been kept. Everything was here. She reached for his hand and he gave it, and they stood like that on the porch of the Lockhart ranch on a September morning in 1895, with the cottonwood trees full and green and swaying in the Kansas wind, and the gun on the mantel inside where it had always been, and Samuel Lockhart in the photograph beside it, and Jeremiah Alden's whistle in his grandson's throat, and the whole long-kept promise of it surrounding them like weather, like land, like the wide and merciful sky.